So I want you to imagine a world where the most fundamental rule of science and medicine, that first do no harm idea, is just completely inverted.
Right. Turned totally upside down.
Exactly. Like what happens when the absolute brightest minds of a nation are just handed unlimited resources and total absolute power over human life?
It's a terrifying hypothetical, but, unfortunately, it's not a hypothetical at all.
No, it's not. And that's exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and today we're looking at an incredibly dark chapter of history. We've got a really compelling stack of sources for this one.
You do, yeah.
We're looking at a biographical profile of a German chemist named Gerhard Schrader, and we're also pulling heavily from some comprehensive excerpts from Paul Weindling's book, which is this meticulously researched text called Victims and Survivors of Nazi Human Experiments.
And the mission of this deep dive really is to explore that dark intersection of scientific ambition and totalitarianism. We want to see how perfectly ordinary, even mundane scientific goals mutated into these highly organized horrors.
Right. And importantly, we're not just looking at the perpetrators. We are specifically focusing on the names, the identities, and the incredible defiance of the victims who were subjected to all of this.
Absolutely. Because we tend to hold on to this comforting illusion that, scientific progress is always going to equal moral progress, and this material just completely shatters that.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think a lot of people, you think of historical atrocities, and you picture chaotic, bloodthirsty violence, like just madness.
Right, like sadistic guards acting out of random cruelty.
Yeah. But the sources reveal something entirely different. It was a chillingly bureaucratic, deliberately scientific process.
Which is so much worse, in a way. I mean, we are looking at university professors, respected researchers, highly trained medical professionals.
So, to kind of set the stage for how civilian science got weaponized so easily, let's start with a story that seems, at first, totally normal.
Yeah, the story of Gerhard Schrader, this really provides the perfect prologue.
Right. So, in the 1930s, Schrader is just this chemist working at Bayer AG. His job is entirely mundane. He is literally just tasked with creating an organic insecticide to protect crops.
Right, trying to kill weevils.
Exactly. Just trying to invent a better mousetrap, basically.
Yeah.
So he's experimenting with combinations of phosphorus compounds and cyanide, and he's trying to find something that targets the nervous systems of these insects.
Which makes sense for an insecticide.
Sure. But then in 1936, he creates a substance called tabun. And then 2 years later, in 1938, he creates sarin.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the biological mechanism of what he accidentally created.
Fascinating and terrifying.
Oh, absolutely terrifying. Because Schrader didn't just formulate a better crop poison. He developed compounds that fundamentally break the nervous system's ability to communicate.
Right.
Nerve agents like sarin, they work by inhibiting this specific enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. And normally this enzyme acts as a sort of chemical off switch for your muscles after a nerve sends a signal to contract.
Right. So without that off switch, the muscle just keeps firing. It can't stop.
Exactly. The nervous system just completely overloads.
And that leads to, what? Continuous convulsions, asphyxiation, and just very rapid death.
Yes. It is unbelievably potent. I mean, during his early experiments with just a precursor to sarin, Schrader was exposed to a microscopic amount.
Just a tiny drop, right?
Barely even that. And he ended up bedridden for weeks. His vision was failing. He was in agony. And his follow-up preparation was so lethal to mammals that Bayer basically immediately recognized this is no longer a civilian agricultural product.
And you would think, in a normal world, if you accidentally invent something that devastating, you'd shut the project down, or at least lock it in a vault.
In a functioning ethical framework, yes. Profound caution would be the bare minimum.
But under the Third Reich, the corporate and state machinery just seamlessly pivoted. The military immediately took over the development of tabun at the Spandau Citadel.
They didn't even blink.
No. And Schrader wasn't disciplined for building a weapon of mass destruction in an agriculture lab. He and his colleague were actually awarded 50,000 Reichsmark.
Which was a massive sum of money at the time.
Huge. And the post-war reality of this is equally jarring, to me anyway. After the war, the Allies held Schrader for 2 years at Kranzberg Castle.
But not to try him for war crimes.
No. Purely so he could sit down and write up his research notes for them on these organic phosphorus compounds.
He just wanted the data.
Exactly. And after that, he just went right back to Bayer. He went on to develop highly successful agricultural insecticides like TPP and parathion, which is E605.
So the boundary between, beneficial science and a weapon of mass destruction was practically non-existent. Schrader represents chemistry weaponized by the state.
Right.
But the medical field experienced this ideological shift that was even more intimate because doctors deal directly with human bodies.
Yeah, that's a whole different level.
It is. The legal framework of the state actively turned healers into agents of racial engineering.
Okay, wait, let's talk about that, because how does a doctor go from treating a patient's illness to acting as a judge on who gets to reproduce? Weren't there ethical guidelines in place?
Well, this is the crazy part. Pre-Nazi Germany actually possessed some of the most progressive medical ethics in the entire world.
Really?
Yeah. Back in 1931, there was this disaster in the city of Lübeck. A botched tuberculosis vaccine killed 72 children. And following that, the government issued strict regulations. They explicitly required informed consent and absolutely forbade experiments on dying subjects.
So the rules were on the books.
They were. But the new regime didn't technically erase those rules. What they did was redefine who the patient was.
I
They
see.
twisted the Hippocratic Oath. They decided the doctor's ultimate duty was to the Volk, the biological race, the state, not the individual.
So the person sitting on the exam table is suddenly just like a single cell in the larger body of the nation.
Exactly. And if that cell is deemed defective, it's the doctor's duty to excise it.
That is chilling. And it was codified in the law super early, right?
Yeah.
July 1933.
Barely months after they took power, the law to prevent hereditary sick progeny, it mandated forced sterilization for conditions they deemed hereditary.
And the list of conditions was wild. It was stuff like schizophrenia, hereditary blindness, severe alcoholism, and this really vague, easily manipulated category they just called feeble-mindedness.
Which could mean almost anything. They set up these specialized tribunals, usually 2 doctors and a lawyer, to just decree sterilizations. Patient consent was completely overridden.
And what's wild to me from reading the sources is that the doctors didn't push back. In fact, this law created a massive research opportunity for them.
Oh, they capitalized on it entirely.
Yeah, like there was this gynecologist, Karl Klauberg. He realized he suddenly had a captive population of thousands of women who were slated for forced sterilization anyway.
Right, and he was being funded by the pharmaceutical company Sharing.
Exactly. So Klauberg uses these procedures to test non-surgical chemical sterilization methods. He was literally injecting women with X-ray contrast fluids, this stuff called neoruntum.
And he wasn't doing this to get better internal imaging.
No. He theorized that the harsh chemicals would cause severe inflammation and scarring inside the reproductive tract. He was trying to literally cement their fallopian tubes shut with scar tissue.
Just so the state could process hundreds of sterilizations a day without the expense of surgery. It's factory line cruelty.
And it wasn't just medical diagnoses, it became pure racial cataloging. The sources talk about the Rhineland bastards.
Right. These were mixed-race adolescents, often the children of German mothers and African or Asian soldiers from the French colonial troops who occupied the Rhineland after World War I.
And they had an anthropologist, Wolfgang Abel, meticulously measure and catalog the physical features of these teenagers before forcibly sterilizing them.
Yeah, the book shares the testimony of a survivor, Hans Hock. He was held by the Gestapo for 14 days for this research.
Just a kid.
Exactly. He recalled being so young he didn't even fully comprehend what castration meant. He just knew he was trapped in a room being examined by men in white coats like he was a specimen, and then forced to sign a document promising he would never marry or have a family.
The psychological terror of that is just, it's unimaginable.
Yeah.
But you can see the logical progression. Once a state decides certain people are unfit to reproduce, it is only a tiny bureaucratic step to decide they are unfit to live.
Which brings us to the T4 euthanasia program.
Yeah. And this targeted psychiatric patients, disabled children, people with congenital conditions. They set up these killing centers disguised as special care units.
With those deeply cynical names.
Yeah. Spiegelgrund, meaning mirror ground, or Wiesengrund, meadow ground. It sounds so peaceful. But they were using lethal injection, starvation, and gas chambers.
And this highly organized murder was entirely intertwined with daily scientific research.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting, but in the darkest, most grotesque way possible. Neuropathologists studying the brain, they didn't just passively receive remains from these camps.
No, they actively requested them.
Yes. Julius Hallervorden, this prominent neuropathologist, collaborated directly with the killing centers. Someone asked him how many brains he could examine, and his literal reply was, an unlimited number, the more the better.
He even provided the specialized jars and the chemical fixatives so the tissues wouldn't spoil in transit.
And there was a doctor on the ground, Heinrich Bunk, who would literally mark the backs of selected patients with a red cross right before they went into the gas chamber.
Just as a visual signal to the staff pulling the bodies out, hey, don't forget to extract the specific brain and ship it to the lab.
It's just horrific.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to look at the why. Why did internationally respected scientists actively participate in mass murder?
Because they just saw it as a windfall.
Right. Exactly. They viewed it as this unprecedented opportunity to map brain abnormalities. To them, it was a rare chance to physically link psychological conditions to neurological defects. Howard Worden would actually visit the centers to observe patients while they were alive to handpick the brains he wanted.
The commodification of human life is just absolute at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, look at George Schaltenbrand.
Oh, his case is staggering.
He was this internationally recognized associate professor of neurology. He even held a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship. And he was researching multiple sclerosis.
Right, and at the time, there was this debated theory that MS might be an infectious disease, like a virus, rather than autoimmune.
So to prove it, he needed to see if it was transmissible. He extracts spinal fluid from apes that showed MS-like symptoms, and he injects that fluid directly into the nervous systems of human psychiatric patients.
People he casually referred to in his own notes as idiotic.
Treating vulnerable humans exactly like lab rats. And when one of his subjects died of an unrelated pneumonia, Schaltenbrand basically just noted how convenient it was.
Right, because it allowed him to dissect the subject's spinal tissue within 20 minutes of death. That level of clinical detachment is just chilling.
It really is. And as the war expanded, that clinical detachment shifted toward military ambition, specifically for the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force.
Yes, they needed extreme physiological data. Their pilots were flying higher than ever. They were crashing into the freezing North Sea.
So the focus shifted from racial hygiene to military survival. And to get that data, they turned to the concentration camps, specifically Dachau.
Spearheaded by Sigmund Rascher, a very ambitious SS doctor.
He essentially used Dachau as a massive unregulated laboratory. He brought a mobile pressure chamber right into the camp. He locked prisoners inside and simulated the atmospheric pressure of dropping from nearly 69,000 feet.
He was testing survivability for pilots bailing out without oxygen.
Right, and he was specifically looking at air embolisms. When atmospheric pressure drops that fast, the gases in your blood literally bubble up.
And those bubbles act like blockages, causing massive strokes or heart attacks.
To observe that physical mechanism in real time, Rusher actually dissected a victim's brain while the man's heart was still beating, just to watch the bubbles form in the blood vessels.
It's pure sadism dressed up as physiology. And it didn't stop there. The Luftwaffe also demanded data on ocean survival.
The freezing water experiments.
Yes. They dressed prisoners in full German pilot gear leather uniforms, flotation jackets, and dumped them into tanks filled with ice water to simulate a North Sea crash.
There's this photograph in the sources. It is incredibly clinical and just haunting. It shows this unknown victim wearing a pilot's helmet just floating in the ice tank. And hovering right over him, leaning on the edge of the tank, are scientists in crisp uniforms holding clipboards.
Taking notes while a man freezes to death.
I mean, for you listening, just try to imagine the sheer terror of that. You're a prisoner in Dachau, starving, traumatized. Suddenly they give you slightly better food for a few days.
Just to build up your baseline a bit.
Right. And then they drag you into a room, put a pilot suit on you, and throw you into an ice tank. And the last thing you see, as your core temperature plummets and your organs shut down, are these men methodically recording your vital signs.
It's the ultimate reduction of a human being to a data point. They timed exactly how long it took for the heart to stop.
But I have to ask, was any of this even yielding actual usable science? Or was it just torture?
Well, medically speaking, the data was highly flawed. A starving, chronically stressed prisoner obviously does not share the physiological baseline of a well-fed, highly trained fighter pilot.
Right, the variables are all wrong.
Exactly. But the tragedy is that the military establishment did treat it as real science. In October 1942, Rascher's data on freezing and rewarming was presented at a major medical conference in Nuremberg.
To mainstream respected physiologists and military doctors.
Yes, and nobody pulled the fire alarm. No one walked out.
That is insane to me.
The wider academic community did not protest the blatant murder. Instead, they engaged in rigorous academic debate over his methodology.
Like critiquing the technical details.
Exactly. They questioned whether using fresh water in a tank accurately simulated the specific heat loss mechanics of the salty ocean.
Oh my God.
By focusing solely on the technical variables, they tacitly validated the research. They completely ignored the torture.
That clinical silence is terrifying.
Yeah.
But, we really cannot just look at the perpetrators here. We have to look at the victims, not just as statistics, but as individuals who fought back.
Absolutely. And Weindling's research is so crucial for that because it restores agency to the victims. Even in this environment engineered for total subjugation, people resisted.
The sources highlight two profound acts of defiance that really stood out to me. The first is the Ravensbrück rabbits.
Right. This goes back to a medical dispute following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich.
He was a high-ranking Nazi who died from a wound infection, right? Because he wasn't treated with sulfonamide drugs, which are basically early antibacterial agents.
Exactly. The leading SS surgeon, Karl Gebhardt, had advised against using them. So to save face with his superiors, Gebhardt needed to definitively prove that his surgical methods were superior to these new drugs.
And to get his proof, he goes to the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück. He selects a group of Polish female political prisoners, and the doctors deliberately inflict these deep gashes into the women's legs, cutting right down to the muscle.
And then they forced wood shavings, glass shards, and tetanus bacteria into the wounds.
To simulate dirty battlefield injury.
Yes. And then they tested different treatments on them. The women suffered agonizing pain, gangrene, permanent disability.
And their fellow inmates started calling them the rabbits, as in laboratory test rabbits, as a mark of solidarity.
But these women refused to just be passive test subjects. They organized.
Yeah, this is incredible. Knowing they could be executed at any second, a woman named Władysława Karolewska and several others submitted a formal, written protest directly to the camp commandant.
And it wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a precise legal argument.
Right. They astutely cited that under international law, it was strictly forbidden to perform experimental operations on political prisoners without consent.
It's a breathtaking act of moral defiance, asserting your human rights in a facility designed to strip you of them.
And they didn't stop there. They managed to smuggle news of their torture out to the Polish underground,
along with clandestine photographs of their mutilated legs,
which were then transmitted to London. They literally forced the outside world to bear witness.
It's just incredible bravery.
It really is. And the second story of defiance takes us back to the racial anthropologists. In Vienna, researchers rounded up stateless Jews in a sports stadium.
They wanted to take physical measurements and make plaster face masks.
Right, trying to establish a so-called Jewish index before deporting these individuals to camps, attempting to biologically catalog a population they were simultaneously trying to eradicate.
And Weinling's text documents this 16-year-old boy named Gustav Ziegler, who later changed his name to Gershon Evan. He was forced to sit for this plaster mask process.
But Gustav didn't view himself as a victim in that chair. He viewed his survival and the creation of that very mask as a concrete act of defiance.
He recognized that his actual physical face completely disproved the perverse, caricatured stereotypes the regime was plastering all over their propaganda.
He knew their science was a fabricated lie.
Which raises an important question about legacy, doesn't it? The state utilized their bodies as involuntary data points, but their minds, their sense of self, remain totally unbroken.
Yeah. So what does this all mean for us? We started by looking at a system where medical ethics were inverted. And the history we've explored today shows us that science is not inherently moral. It is merely a tool.
Exactly. The machinery of scientific inquiry requires the ethical compass of the scientists themselves. Without it, the lab just follows whoever holds the funding and the authority.
Right. Without an ironclad commitment to human rights and empathy, the pursuit of knowledge seamlessly becomes an instrument for unspeakable cruelty.
And we benefit from those hard-learned lessons today.
We do. The next time you sit in a doctor's office and you sign a form for informed consent before a procedure, remember where that requirement comes from. You have the right to know the risks. You have the right to say no.
Those guidelines weren't drafted in a vacuum?
No, they were forged in the aftermath of these atrocities. They were literally written to prevent the suffering endured by Hans Hock, the Ravensbrück rabbits, and that unknown man floating in the freezing tank.
Which really brings us back to that unsettling thought we started the episode with. The brains of the euthanasia victims, harvested by doctors like Julius Hallervorden, were passed from institute to institute after the war.
Right.
And tissue slides from murdered psychiatric patients were still being used in German medical research until 1990.
1990. It forces us to confront such a difficult reality.
It does.
It leaves us with this lingering question for our modern world. How much of the foundational medical knowledge we rely on today, or the textbook diagrams we just take for granted, was quietly built upon the unacknowledged suffering of forgotten victims?
Where exactly do we draw the line between utilizing tainted historical data to save lives today and being implicitly complicit in the crimes of yesterday?
That is a lot to think about. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.